Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good moed and a freilich in Yom Tov. We continue the journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rav Yosef Halevi Weinberg, Olav HaShalom, of Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz, Olav HaShalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKoyen Khan, Olav HaShalom. It is also in schus and merit of Zev Yecheskel and Arisha Katz, Le'erich Yomim V'shonim Tevis, for many long, healthy years. So we're thick in middle of the chapter 3, Perek Gimel of Tanya, where he's discussing the personality and the very anatomy of the divine soul, of the Nefesh Elikis. We know it has a divine personality, Chelik Elikam Imal Mamish, elaborated upon in chapter 2. Now, Alter Rebbe is explaining how every component of this divine soul, which is an inherent part of every neshama, of every Jew within us, every component of it is also divine. The mind, the conscious intellect, the cognitive faculties, the emotional faculties, which are born from the cognitive, because we're not just talking about the natural soul's love and connection, but also in the process of internalizing that, of bringing that etzem, bringing that core connection of the bonim atam l'Hashem Elokeichem, the ben, that every soul is like a child of its father, in this case, of Chachmosei Machshavtei Yisbarach, which is one and connected with the divine itself, Chelik Elikam Imal Mamish. Not just that that's an existing reality, that's, like it is an example, a biological fact, but also the faculties that the divine soul is armed with resources on all levels to also behave in a divine way. And when I say behave, I don't just mean I'm going to talk about machshava, dibra, ma'isa, thought, speech, action in an expressive way, but the very faculties of the divine soul are divine. That it contemplates and connects with, both on a conceptual level, which is chachma, the father, and on a comprehensive level and comprehension of bina, the mother, chachma and bina, which comes koyach elapel, which brings the nukuda, the spark, the kernel, the seed of chachma, of the wisdom of the concept, into a fully developed idea, and that will give birth to the emotions. And what type of emotions? Also divine emotions, beginning with yira b'moyach. This is critical to remember, yira b'moyach, so it corresponds with the chachma, yira, the awe, yiras haremamus, the awe of the grandeur and majesty of the divine, which will then become pachad b'libay, that also not just in the mind but also in the heart feel an actual trepidation and a reverence. That in turn, v'shuv, will turn into a love, a flaming love, a passionate love, kirish be'esh, in the emotions, to want to become one and become encompassed, the thirst to become encompassed and connected with this divine. So the contemplation is Amamala Kalam, Seviv Kalam, and Kula Kamei Kala Chashav, as we learned. The three levels, the divine as it fills existence, as it transcends existence, and that's beyond everything, even transcendence, everything is nullified before it. That in turn gives birth. Neildov and Eser Midas Yiras Haremus B'moiche Machshavtei, Shalira Lizbeishis Migdulasi Yisbarach, which has no end, then Lesof V'tachlis, then Pachad Hashem B'libay, V'shruv Yislav Libay, Ba'ava Aza Keris Be'esh, B'chasheka V'chafetza V'tshuka, V'nefesh Sheikeka, L'gedulas Ein Sof Baruchu, V'hi Kleis HaNefesh, that the nefesh actually expires. So it desires, it is lusting for, desiring, and yearning, to the point that it expires, it languishes, it completely loses itself. Kleis HaNefesh, Nichsafa, V'gam Kolsa Nafshi. And the three verses that he brought, that was one. The second verse, Ksivtzoma Nafshi Lelekim, my soul is thirsty to you godliness, and Soma Lecha Nafshi. That's what we arrived at. So we're talking about the pining and longing and all the different levels of how love, in its fiery passion, desires something that follows the initial awe of Yiras Harememus and Pachad B'Libay. So now, to take this a step further, the Alter Rebbe does not suffice with that. He's going to go further into the anatomy of the divine soul, and is going to discuss the very components, what defines the divine soul, in addition to the faculties, which we talked about, Chochmah and Bina, and the Midas, primarily the Midas of Ava and Yira, or Yira and Ava, and the rest will be branches, as he'll soon mention. So now he goes further. If you remember at the end of chapter 1 in Tanya, he spoke about this, the Daled Yesodes, the 4 elements, 4 archetypal elements and personality types, you could say dispositions, of the animal soul. Eish, Ruach, Mayim, Ofer. And that is part of the components. So in addition to the faculties of the animal soul, there's also the elements. And that, from there, he said, come all in the, when it comes to the animal soul, he said from there are derived, the exact language, all the different midas rois, the different negative personalities that come from those 4 elements. Kol hamidas rois ma'arbi yuseidus haroim. Albi yuseidus haroim. So we see that the elements are universal in the sense that they're like the building blocks of every structure. In this case, we're not talking about physical fire, we're talking about personality types, archetypes, dispositions. So now he's going to say that in the divine soul you also have the elements. In Torah Eir, the beginning of Parsha Miketz, he actually spells it out, and in other places, that it has the 4 elements, the Nefesh Elokis, the divine soul. Here he's going to talk about 2 of the 4. He's going to talk about Eish and Mayim, which is relevant to our discussion here. He's not going to talk about Ruach and Ofer. So Eish and Mayim, and that very elements, the very building blocks of the divine soul, in addition to the faculties, in a way they're almost like the root of the faculties and how they function. Because when you say Chochmah and Bina, what we've learned till now is that Chochmah is concept, a seed. Bina develops it, like a father and a mother. So the seed and the child develops, the emotions develop in the mother's womb. Bina develops this kernel of the seed of Chochmah. But we still don't know what about their personalities. What are they like? So he's now going to talk about the personality type of both Bina and Chochmah, but especially in the context of what we're saying now, because we're talking about Midas. But before we talk about Midas, we have to go back to the root of the Midas as what gives birth to these Midas. So right now he's going to say the following. Let's learn it inside, after this introduction, and he's going to basically explain this thirst that we're talking about, this passionate thirst that's in the emotions, the Ava, Kiddush Be'esh, is an emotion inside of the divine soul. Where does the passion come from? She says it comes from the element of Eish in the Nefesh Elokis. And let's read inside. So he says, V'hatsemoyin, and the thirst. This thirsting that we just talked about, which comes as an outgrowth, as a birthed by the contemplation, that awakens a thirst. But where is this thirst coming from? How does the divine soul have thirst in it? She says it comes from from the elemental and archetypal fire disposition in the divine soul. So the divine soul has an element of fire, in this context passion, but it remains dormant. What happens when the mind, the Chochmah, and the Bina conceive and contemplate on the divine, and in a way that you really immerse yourself, like he said, that it's not a superficial contemplation. So he says that gives birth and awakens the Yira b'moyach, but then the Pachad b'lev, and then the Tzemoyin in the fiery love in the heart. Yislav liboy ba'ava azo. So where's this fire? The fire is there already. Chochmah and Bina ignite it, but the fire is in the Nefesh Elokis, And that's why there is a tzemoyin. That's why it can create a tzemoyin, a thirst, a passionate thirst. And that's what he says here. And he brings proof. Why does he bring proof? The Alter Rebbe doesn't always bring a source, because he wants to show that this is an inherent component. It's not just an experience, it's not just a verb, an action, the behavior of the divine soul. It's actually the personality of the divine soul. So he says, that's the first source he brings. As the natural scientists write, Tivim refers to those that study nature. The natural scientists, the Tivim. Which tells us that this is a natural thing in the spirit, the idea of tzemoyin from Yesod HaEsh, that the thirst and the passion in a human being's personality, in this case he's talking about the Nefesh HaLekis, comes from Yesod HaEsh. V'chein hu be'etz chaim, and so is also written similarly in Eitz Chaim, which is of course written by Rab Chaim Vital, but is the Teres HaRizal, called Kisva Rizal, and Eitz Chaim, she Yesod HaEsh hu believe that the element of fire is in the heart. So in which heart? The heart of the divine soul, obviously he's speaking about here, because he's talking about the Nefesh HaLekis. Now the truth is, the idea that a personality, a human personality, has passion and fire in the heart is not necessarily about the divine soul. That's talking about the spirit of a human being has that. But here, we're describing it in the context of the Nefesh HaLekis, because that's how the Alter Rebbe began. Hatzemoyin misay the Esha b'Nefesh HaLekis. Which tzemoyin? This thirst that we're talking about, the thirsting for godliness. In concept, any thirsting, even if it's for something that's neutral, or God forbid, even if something negative, is also coming. But that could also be associated with the animal soul. There he talks in chapter 1 that it's the source of kas, anger, and gaiva, and arrogance. But here he's talking about the divine soul, so it's the thirst of the divine soul. Here is not relevant to us, any other type of thirst, but since he brings tivim, it's clearly he's talking about something in the natural part of the human being, because they're not talking necessarily about the divine soul. But the Eitz Chaim, you say the Eish hu belev. So what do we have now? In the lev. Now we're talking about the nev of the Nefesh HaLekis. So the passion and the fire is avekadish be'esh, is a burning fire, a flaming fire, b'chasheke, b'chafetze, b'tshuka. So now we understand that this personality type, this element of fiery passion, a love, a fiery passion, like fiery love, is associated with the Yesod HaEsh. And then the Alter Rebbe continues. He says, he doesn't suffice with that. He says, Umoked hamayim v'halechus. He says, just as we talk about that there's the element of fire, there's also an element of water. A personality, archetypal disposition or personality type within the divine soul called water. And what does he say? That the root or the source, Moked hamayim v'halechus, of the water and moisture is rooted in the brain. Is mahamoyach. Umoked hamayim v'halechus mahamoyach comes from the moyach. So the tzemoyin eish is from the heart, or in the heart, and the root of moisture. Now we're not talking about necessarily physical moisture. He's talking about mayim as an archetype in context and contrast to fire, which we'll discuss in a moment what that is from the moyach. And here too he brings the source from Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim Shar Nun. He actually gives us the actual source, like it says in Eitz Chaim section 50. What does he say there? Shehi b'chinas chochma shenikra mayim shebenefesh ha'elokis. That chochma is the elemental water of the divine soul. So here we're talking explicitly the divine soul. Now everything here is about the divine soul. I was just qualifying that tivim means in general the spirit of the human being. So now of course becomes the question, why is this relevant? Why do we need to know about mayim? We've been talking about the emotional passion of the fiery passion of love of the divine soul as it languishes, as it yearns and longs, and all the different levels toward godliness. Kleis HaNefesh. So which is a deep thirst, a fiery thirst, so it comes from Yesod Ha'esh B'lev, everything is fine. Why does the Alter Rebbe have to bring Umokar HaMayim V'Alechus? Why are we talking about water and moisture? Is rooted in the moyach, and not just the moyach, in chokhmah. So on a very basic level, the answer for that is, because if we go back a few lines earlier, what did he say? He first began that the first result, the first offspring, so to speak, that's born and awakened and stimulated from contemplation of Bina, which takes chokhmah, and Bina is the mother which takes me, the idea that is conceived in koyach ma'av chokhmah, to understand it well and in depth. What is the first result of that? What's the first birthing, so to speak? The first birthing is Yira b'moyach. So it says in Chassidus, and later in Tanya he's going to speak about it, that Yira b'moyach, especially is connected to moyach ha-chochmah, is from Yesod HaMayim. Because Yira, in contrast to fiery passion, is a state of bittul. So in the Midas, let's talk about the Midas before we get to the Meichin. So Yira, even though he said Yira is b'moyach, but the idea of Yira is bittul. Ava, passion, a fiery passion, is a very strong feeling of you. You're feeling attracted and drawn to something. So it's very much you are involved in that process. In Chokhmah, and specifically Yira, which comes from Chokhmah, like he'll say later in Tanya, and also in the beginning of Likutei Torah and Parsha Chukas, the Alter Rebbe states it very explicitly. He says clearly, he says the word, Shabchinis Yiru, Bitlu, Bchinis Yesod HaMayim Shebemoyach HaChokhmah, Koyachma, the beginning of Chukas, Parsha Chukas and Likutei Torah. So it's a state of bittul, like Chokhmah. Bittul is water. Water is calm, and actually the opposite of fire. Fire is drawn upward. Fire rises. Water descends. Yeridin from a higher level to a lower level. What is that in Aveda? In Aveda, it's a settled state. So later, in chapter 9 in Tanya, he's going to talk about this some more, and also especially in chapter 50, which I'll get to in a moment. But let me just continue here the point. So why is the Alter Rebbe bringing here Mayim? But Pashtus, because he's also, remember, Chokhmah is also part of this process. Chokhmah is the kernel and the seed that gave birth to, was the beginning process that Bina developed, and both of them gave birth together, father and mother, to the Midas. So even though Chokhmah is somewhat detached from the emotions, because it's still a kernel, and you don't yet have emotional development, that comes from the mother, from Bina, but to say that it's completely disassociated, also not. As a matter of fact, the Yira, B'moiche, associates with the Chokhmah. So the Alter Rebbe is bringing that back into the picture, that we don't just have Yesod Ha'esh in the Nefesh Elikis, we also have Yesod HaMayim, which is rooted in Chokhmah. Mayim V'lechus, a type of moisture, and a lachluchis, as we call it, a certain sense, but it's very different than the effect of fire. As a matter of fact, what does water do to fire? It tames it. It could even quench this great thirst. So that's the obvious reason why he brings it. But let's go a little deeper. When you go later in Tanya, so even though the Alter Rebbe is not referring yet there because we haven't learned it, in chapter 9, when he uses this idea that the Nefesh Elikis, that's where you first find the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Abamis confronting each other. The battle between both of them. So what do we learn there? We learn there that the Nefesh Elikis, its role is to fight the animal soul with everything it has, which is to awaken in its mind. The mind contemplates on the divine. He uses literally almost the same expressions. That in turn gives birth to the awe and to the reverence and to the love, the fiery love. But then he says, more than just fiery love. Then there's even a greater love, Ava Rabbi, he says, which is called Ava B'tainugim. That's connected to water. And that has the power to actually transform the animal soul's water, which is the source of all the pleasures of this world. That's what he says there. So you see he's bringing Ava Kamayim, the idea of Mayim, that's rooted in Chokhmah. So we have basically that there's an element that's necessary also. Right now, he's not discussing the details. Later in chapter 50 in Tanya, it goes even further. There we see that the idea of right now, you can say Eish and Mayim, you could say two levels of Ava. We know there's an Ava Kamayim, there's an Ava Ka'esh. Let's go to the reverse order, because first we speak about there's a passionate fire of love, searching and yearning for something. It's called fiery love. But then there's another thing called Ava Kamayim, watery love. And that's associated at times with Ava B'tainugim, pleasurable love. That's not the love from a distance where you feel a deep passion and thirst. That's a love that you're already immersed in the thing you love. The example that the Rebbe Rashab gives, like when a person loves themselves. It's not with fire and passion, because it's you. It's just a certain calm, like a watery calm type of love. So it's very different than the fiery, passionate love. And that love, he says there, in Perek Nun, in chapter 50, he says, the fiery love comes from Bina, because Bina is Gvuris. Bina is the side of Gvura. Eish, Smoil, like says there, Zov, gold, compared to the Kesef of Chesed of the Kohen, the Levim. That's what he says. Bina is the root of that passionate, fiery love. But then you go to another level where he says, you need that love has to be quenched, because in passion and desire, the Klois HaNefesh is ultimately not the Kavon. That's not the intention. You want to bring down that passion, like he says, Al Korcha Chatachai, the Kavona, the purpose of life is not Nadav and Avihu. In their great passion, as the Erechaim explains the language, they expired, their souls expired in a fire, an Eish Zara, in a fire. What was lacking? Was lacking bringing down the Rotzeh and the Shuv, that it should return where the Kavana is, the purpose is to serve God on this earth, make a Dira B'Tachtenim. And that's where water comes into play. So we can't just have the purely passion. Passion is a beautiful thing. And it's taka born, as he says here, Ava Ka'esh. But now he's bringing that there's also the need for Mayim, that quenches the thirst and draws down that passion back to earth, so to speak, integrating it, internalizing it. So both are necessary. So in essence, you can say that you have Eish and Mayim both in the emotions of the divine soul and in the mind of the divine soul. In the emotions, it's the idea of Ava Ka'esh and Ava Kamayim. Though he doesn't refer to it explicitly, but those are the two levels of love. Or Ava Ka'esh and Ava B'tainugim, fiery love, pleasurable love. In the mind, that's the difference between Chachma and Bina. Chachma is on the right side, Bina is on the left side, corresponding to Chesed and Gvura. But in the mind, obviously, it's not an emotional fire and passion, and it's not an emotional form of waterly love or pleasurable love. There, it's more on a cognitive level. But the midas are rooted there, and that's why Chassidus talks about this. Will also be discussed later in Tanya, chapter 16, then later chapter 38 and 39 and 43 and 44, the idea of tchila v'rechimu tivim and sichlim, that there's natural love, and there's a love that comes through the mind, that the mind directs and guides and gives birth to the love. Here he's talking about emotions that are born from seichel. Very clear, that's this chapter 3. He's not talking about the natural love that every Jew has, every neshama has, the Ava Misoteres that he's going to speak about later in chapters 18 and on, 18, 19, and refers to it, alludes to it in previous chapters as well, 14 and 15, 14 and 16, I should say. But we're talking here that Chachma and Bina, Bedakus, subtly also have these two tenuas, these two movements. Chachma is far more detached, I'm going to say aloof, much cooler in a sense, and Bina is the root, as he says in chapter 50, of the passions. So what do we have? That the Alter Rebbe here, though he doesn't elaborate, but he's bringing into the picture, but not just the midas of that are the passionate midas that come from Bina, but also that which is rooted in Chachma, which is a far more subtler form of emotions. So in Chachma and Bina, the emotions are still called midas sichlim, which means they're on the level of seichel. So there's and we talk about an excitement in the mind. Your mind is excited, your mind is passionate, or your mind is calm. That would be the Ava Kamayim within the mind. The Ava Shebemayach, in other words. The midas in the seichel. And the way it expresses itself in emotions is a fiery passion of the heart, or the ava kamayim, or a pleasurable or watery type of love from the that is coming from chesed, which is the element of rooted in chachma and bina respectively. So that helps us explain this idea. Some also say, some chassidim interpret that we're not discussing here ava b'tainugim. That's why the Alter Rebbe brings primarily ava kadish b'yesh, because ava b'tainugim associates with mayim. So as far as emotions go, it seems to be that the bigger focus here is on the passion of emotions. Now, saying that, I should also add, passion of emotions really is all emotions. Not just chesed b'chlal, emotions are fiery. However, the main focus and the main place where you see the fire of emotions is in ava. In the soul's thirst for godliness, which is the strong and powerful, intense love, like burns like fire. The Rebbe Friedrich Rebbe speaks about this in a Maimer V'Har Sinai, Tov Shin Aleph, in 1941. He said a Maimer V'Har Sinai, chapter 2. Okay. So now we have a picture here that's developing in further understanding the anatomy of the divine soul, and now both elements, the fire element and the water element, which are rooted respectively in Bina and Chachma. Now, not all this is explicitly stated. When you learn later in Tanya, it becomes very clear that the connection here. So everything is covered here. The Chachma is involved in the process because Chachma is the root of Yira Saremus, which is in the form more of Mayim. Like he says, and now, once we've established that, so now we've covered that the divine soul, wherever you look at it, whether it's in the mind, in Chachma or Bina, whether it's in the emotions of Yira Saremus b'moyach, machshavte, pachad beliboy, in the heart, the pachad. And then the ava karish be'esh. And now we're talking about the tzemoyin from the Yeseda Eish, from the element of fire. And what comes from moyach, the mayim. So the divine soul, every part of it is divine. Whether it's a thirst, whether it's a calm, whether it's emotions, whether it's emotions in the mind or actual emotions that are expressed in its emotional expression of it. So now you would say, okay, we covered Chesed and Gvura, Ava and Yira, or Yira and Ava in the order that the Tanya states. So now there's other 5 emotions. We said clearly in the beginning of the chapter that there's 7 emotions. Sheva Kfules. The Alter Rebbe says he's not going to discuss the rest of them because Shad Hamidas Kulam Hein Amfi Hayira Va'ava V'Tel Deseyan. All the other emotions are branches and derivatives of awe and love, like it says elsewhere. The elsewhere are many different places, but Nageres HaKedesh, the 4th section in Tanya, section 15, he discusses it, as well as in the Maimer Va'era, in Tovkuf Samach Beis of the Alter Rebbe, and many other places. The key thing to point out here is that the most important focus in this chapter is not the breakdown of the emotions. There are other places where that will be discussed. The key thing here is to demonstrate and emphasize how every part of the divine soul and all its components are divine. And Ava V'Yira cover the emotions because everything else is a derivative and a branch of that. So though the emotions break into 7 different branches and 7 different forms of emotional expression, but generally they go into the 2 categories. Ava means to be attracted to something, you're drawn to it, which is like love, or you're repelled by it, which is like awe. You stay away, respect, and everything else is a derivative of that. And since the awe and love, the Yir and the Ava, are born and stimulated and awakened through Chachma and Bina, through the kernel and seed of Chachma and the development of Bina, and they are the root of all the derivative emotions, so that means all the other emotions in turn will be awakened and stimulated as well. Why doesn't he mention Tiferes? though he mentioned in the beginning of the chapter, he did mention Tiferes specifically. So one of the reasons is because in Ageres HaKedesh 15, he says, because Tiferes is a midah mumutzas, it's like a mix of chesed and gvura. So in context of what we're discussing here, he's not coming to define every emotion. He's coming to establish that the emotional structure of the divine soul is drawn to the divine and stands in awe of the divine in the reverse order. And here's where we'll stop. Everyone have a very good Kiben Shtiyar and a good Yontif. If you want to find these programs, go to TanyaApply.com. Thank you very much. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.